In 1914, as Europe plunged into an abyss of blood and darkness, the leaders back in Washington were looking at a different kind of map. They weren't just worried about the trenches abroad, they were terrified of what was happening right here in our own streets. Socialism was spreading like wildfire. Organized labor such as the IWW was everywhere, and class conflict was getting louder by the day. Senator Wadsworth openly warned that our people were dividing into classes. Radical writer Randolph Bourne caught onto the truth early when he wrote that war is the health of the state. The establishment needed a giant distraction. They needed something big enough to put out the fires of domestic rebellion, wrap the working man in a flag, and turn class anger into patriotic fervor. President Woodrow Wilson campaigned on keeping America out of the bloodbath, but behind the scenes, the ledger told a different story. In 1914, the country was sliding into a deep recession. The solution? War orders. By 1917, American industrialists had sold over $2 billion worth of goods to the Allies, tying our national prosperity directly to a British victory. When a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania in 1915, Washington cried foul, calling it an attack on an innocent passenger ship. But the government hid the truth. The Lusitania's manifests were falsified. She wasn't just carrying passengers, she was a floating arsenal packed with millions of rounds of ammunition and thousands of artillery shells. The march to war wasn't about high ideals, it was about protecting the bottom line. The history textbooks talk about a nation united in patriotic fervor, but the raw numbers tell a very different story. In the first 6 weeks after Congress declared war, only 73,000 men volunteered to fight. The working class simply didn't want this war, so the government forced them into it with a draft. To crush the reluctance, Washington built a massive propaganda machine called the Creel Committee. They flooded the country with 75,000 official speakers delivering 750,000 state-approved speeches, plastering walls with posters, and telling neighbors to spy on neighbors. They ordered citizens to report anyone telling pessimistic stories to the Department of Justice. This wasn't a spontaneous surge of patriotism. It was a carefully engineered system of intimidation designed to manufacture a consensus that didn't exist. With the draft taking men by force, the government knew it couldn't tolerate any criticism of its policies. So in June 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act. On paper, it claimed to protect public discussion. In reality, it was a legal sledgehammer used to crush political dissent. Suddenly, writing a pamphlet or giving a speech against the draft could land you 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Under this law, the government launched over 2,000 prosecutions, locking up nearly 900 citizens just for speaking their minds. Even the Supreme Court stepped in to validate the crackdown. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that criticizing the war wasn't free speech. It was the equivalent of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. The state had decided that in a war for global democracy, democracy at home had to be put in chains. The ultimate test of the government's crackdown came in June 1918, when federal agents targeted the most powerful voice of the working class, Eugene V. Debs. Debs had just visited 3 friends locked up in an Ohio jail for opposing the draft. He walked across the street, stood before a massive crowd, and spoke for 2 straight hours. He didn't parse words. He told them, wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. That speech was his ticket to a federal cell. He was arrested under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The state had made its message clear. It didn't matter if you were a 5-time presidential candidate. If you challenged the narrative of the war machine, you would be broken. While individual dissenters were locked away, the state used the cover of war to completely eliminate its biggest domestic threat, the industrial workers of the world. In a coordinated strike, federal agents raided 48 IWW halls nationwide, seizing literature and arresting over 100 union leaders. After a massive 5-month trial, a jury found every single one of them guilty. Big Bill Haywood and 14 others were handed 20-year sentences, effectively breaking the backbone of the one big union. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, 50,000 Americans lay dead in Europe, leaving a trail of deep bitterness back home. But the war against the working class didn't stop at the armistice. Terrified of a post-war socialist surge, the government launched the brutal Palmer raids, deporting thousands of immigrants and sending a final, chilling message to the graves of Sacco and Vanzetti. Global conflicts may end, but the class war is permanent.